My name is Celeste. I'm 72. I live alone now in a house near the lake, where the mist settles thickest in the mornings. It was Christmas dinner, a tableau painted in familiar holiday cheer. But for me, it was the moment the brush stroke faltered. The air hummed with the scent of pine and roasted ham, a warmth that, for the first time, felt entirely external, not something that permeated my skin. Arthur, my son-in-law, a man I had once thought of as kind, gestured with an expansive sweep of his hand towards the head of the table. "Eleanor, darling, please sit here." Eleanor, my husband's second wife, younger by 15 years, with a laugh that tinkled a bit too loudly for my comfort, smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smile, not overtly, but it held a possessiveness that coiled in my gut. The seat he offered was my seat, the seat I had occupied for 45 Christmases, ever since Robert and I had first bought this house, this very table. It was where I always sat, directly opposite the fireplace, where the fire's glow warmed my back, where I could see everyone, gauge the mood, the subtle shifts in conversation. It was my silent command center, the heart of my home, even after Robert was gone. No one else seemed to notice. My daughter, Clara, was fussing with the cranberries, her back to the scene. My grandchildren, wrapped in their youthful exuberance, were already tearing into presents in the living room, their shouts a distant echo. Robert, bless his soul, had been gone 5 years by then, and perhaps in the general reshuffling of grief and new arrangements, my quiet displacement went unremarked. But I noticed, every fiber of my being registered the slight, the erasure. It wasn't just the seat. Later, over the clinking of glasses and the easy flow of conversation, Arthur began to recount the story of Robert's adventurous youth. He spoke of the time Robert had hitchhiked across Europe, a journey he'd undertaken before we even met, a story I had heard countless times, a story I often embellished with details Robert himself had forgotten. But tonight, Arthur told it as if it were a new discovery, a revelation he'd unearthed himself. And as he spoke, his gaze rested not on me, the keeper of Robert's legacy, but on Eleanor, who nodded along, her eyes wide with feigned fascination. He spoke of Robert's dream of seeing the Swiss Alps, a dream I had helped fund, encouraged, and meticulously planned for him, even though I couldn't go at the time. Yet my name, my involvement was absent from his narrative. It was as if I were a ghost at my own family's feast. The true fracture, however, came with the candle. Clara, bless her heart, had found an old box of Christmas decorations in the attic, treasures from forgotten years. Among them was a set of beeswax candles, handmade, with faint, almost imperceptible etchings. One in particular caught my eye. It was slender, cream-colored, and on its side, barely visible unless you held it just so, were the initials RM plus EF. Robert Marcus and Eleanor Finch. Eleanor Finch. His first love. A girl from his high school days, a brief, passionate entanglement that had ended abruptly when her family moved away. He had spoken of her, casually, fondly, in the way one speaks of a pleasant, long-past dream. He'd shown me a faded photograph once, a sepia-toned image of a girl with bright, laughing eyes, a girl who, I now realized with a chill, bore a striking resemblance to the woman sitting in my chair. This candle, this innocent little object, was a forgotten relic of a love that preceded mine, a love I had never truly considered a threat. But here it was, brought back into the light, a silent testament to a chapter of Robert's life that had nothing to do with me, yet was now, inexplicably, part of my Christmas. My daughter, unwittingly, had brought it down, placed it on the mantelpiece just above where Eleanor now sat, bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace. I watched it, the initials almost mocking me in their delicate script. A wave of something cold and unfamiliar washed over me, not anger, not yet, but a profound, aching sense of displacement. It wasn't enough that Eleanor had my husband's last years, or that she now sat in my rightful place at the table, or that Arthur was erasing my history with Robert. Now, even the ghosts of his past were invited to the present, their names etched into the very fabric of my holiday. The evening wore on, a cacophony of cheer that felt increasingly hollow. I smiled when I was supposed to, offered polite responses, but inside, a quiet storm was brewing. A seed of something hard and resolute began to take root. They had rearranged the world around me, silently, effortlessly, as if my presence were negligible. But a negligible presence can still exert a powerful force. They had taken my seat, my story, and now even the memory of a love that was supposed to be mine alone. As the last guests finally departed and the house settled into a deep post-celebration quiet, I walked over to the mantelpiece. The candle, with its faint accusing initials, stood sentinel. I picked it up, feeling the cool beeswax in my palm. It was just a candle, a forgotten trinket. But in that moment, it felt like a declaration, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the time for quiet acceptance was over. The game had changed, and I would change it back. If this story echoes something buried in you, a quiet like or subscribe helps keep these voices from fading. After that Christmas dinner, the silence began to seep in, not as an absence of sound, but as an oppressive weight. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow, deliberate erosion, like the lake's gentle lapping against the shore, wearing away the land imperceptibly, grain by grain. The house, once alive with the cacophony of family, became a monument to quiet omissions. Clara, my daughter, was the first to contribute to this silence, though I believe she never intended to. Her life with Arthur had become a whirlwind of school plays, soccer tournaments, and endless committee meetings. She'd call, but her voice was always tinged with haste, a quick check-in between tasks. "Are you all right, Mother? Everything okay?" It was a perfunctory question, the answer already assumed. My "yes, dear, perfectly fine" became a reflex. A lie I repeated until it felt like a truth, even to myself. How could I articulate the quiet sliver of pain that came with being forgotten when she herself was so busy living a life I had helped her build? Then there was the family photo album. For years, it had been my ritual to update it, to meticulously arrange the glossy prints, adding captions in my neat, looping script. After Robert passed, Eleanor took on this task. At first, I was relieved. My hands, arthritic with age, fumbled with the delicate corners of the prints. But soon I noticed a pattern. The photos of family gatherings, once a tapestry of all of us, began to feature Eleanor more prominently. Her radiant smile, her arm linked through Clara's, her head tilted charmingly towards one of the grandchildren. My own image, when it appeared, was often relegated to the background, blurred or partially obscured. It was as if I were a distant relative, a benevolent but ultimately peripheral figure. The album, once a chronicle of our life, became a visual testament to their new, evolving family, with me slowly fading from its pages. The grandchildren, once my eager conspirators in whispered secrets and cookie-baking adventures, grew taller, their interests shifting from my stories to their screens. They were polite, always. "Grandma Celeste," they'd say, their voices kind but distant. They'd hug me quickly, a fleeting embrace before darting off to their own worlds. They weren't malicious, not at all. They were simply busy, and I was simply there. A comfortable fixture, like the antique grandfather clock in the hall, admired but rarely truly engaged with. Eleanor, meanwhile, flourished in this unspoken arrangement. She moved through my home, which was now officially Robert's home with her, with an almost regal ease. She rearranged my grandmother's porcelain figurines on the mantel, replaced my worn, comfortable throw pillows with sleek, modern ones, and even started planting new rose bushes in the garden, the very spot where Robert and I had planned our own rose garden years ago. Each small change was a whisper, a gentle assertion of her presence, of her ownership. She never consulted me, never asked for my opinion. She simply did it, and then would comment, "Doesn't it look lovely, Celeste?" And I, trapped in a polite, suffocating silence, would nod and agree. The worst part was the way Robert's memory became shared. At family gatherings, if I began a sentence with, "Robert used to say," Eleanor would often interject, "Oh yes, he told me that too. It was when we were at," and she would weave a new ending to my story, a part where I was not present. It was not overtly hostile, no. It was a gentle hijacking, a polite annexation of my shared past. She wasn't stealing his memory. She was simply broadening its scope, making it inclusive of herself, and in doing so, subtly diminishing my unique claim to it. I found myself retreating further into myself, into the quiet corners of the house that still felt entirely mine. My old study, filled with books Robert and I had read together, became my sanctuary. There, surrounded by the familiar scent of aged paper and leather, I could still hear his voice, still feel his hand in mine. But even these moments of solace were tinged with a deep, pervasive grief. Not just for Robert, but for the woman I was becoming. Quiet, overlooked, a shadow in my own life. The silence grew heavy, a cloak woven from unsaid words and unseen slights. I stopped offering opinions, stopped interjecting stories, stopped expecting to be truly seen or heard. It was easier that way, less painful. It was a self-imposed exile, a slow fade into the background. I thought, perhaps, that this was simply the natural order of things, the way of old women in the twilight of their lives. But deep down, a flicker of indignation, tiny and persistent, refused to be extinguished. It was the last ember of the woman I used to be, the woman who had built this life, nurtured this family, and loved Robert with every fiber of her being. That ember, though buried deep beneath layers of silence, was still very much alive. The cost of that silence was heavier than I ever anticipated. It wasn't just the quiet ache in my chest, it was a deeper, more insidious kind of loss. The woman I had been, Celeste, the vibrant, opinionated, laughter-loving woman who had built a life alongside Robert, began to recede, leaving behind a hollow echo. My sense of self was the first casualty. I had always been the orchestrator of our family's gatherings, the keeper of traditions, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who knew everyone's favorite dish. Now, Eleanor had smoothly taken over these roles. She planned the holiday meals, sent out the invitations, even curated the family's summer vacation to the Cape, a place Robert and I had discovered and cherished. When I offered suggestions, they were met with polite smiles and vague acknowledgments, only to be ultimately disregarded. I found myself hovering at the edges of conversations, no longer a participant, but an observer, a silent spectator to a life that once revolved around me. Who was I if not the heart of this family? The question gnawed at me, a persistent wasp trapped inside a glass jar. Then there was my voice. It wasn't that I stopped speaking entirely. I answered questions, made small talk, offered pleasantries. But the ability to express a strong opinion, to tell a detailed story without interruption, to truly be heard, that atrophied. When I did try to interject, to correct a misremembered detail about Robert or share an anecdote from our shared past, the words often felt brittle, breaking against the smooth surface of Eleanor's narratives or Arthur's confident assertions. My voice, once clear and resonant, became a whisper, then a thought, then just a sigh. I learned to swallow my words, to keep my memories tucked away, where they couldn't be dismissed or reinterpreted. The silence became a self-inflicted wound, a way to protect myself from further erasure, but it also sealed me off, making me an island in my own home. Losing Robert a second time was perhaps the most brutal blow. His physical absence was a gaping wound, but the slow, subtle redefinition of his legacy, his memories, his very essence, felt like a constant reopening of that wound. When Eleanor spoke of him, it was always Robert and I, even when she was recounting events that predated their relationship, weaving herself into the tapestry of his life as if she had always been there. His preferences, his quirks, his inside jokes, they were slowly being reframed through her lens, not mine. It was as if our 50 years together, the tapestry of shared laughter and quiet understanding, was being unpicked, thread by thread, and restitched with new colors. I knew the man she knew was a fragment, a later chapter. But they were acting as if her chapter was the whole book, and I, who had written the first, most formative volumes, was being quietly edited out. My youth, or rather the vibrant memories of it, seemed to fade faster in this environment. The energy I once had, the curiosity, the desire to explore new things, they withered under the weight of being unseen. It was as if the constant vigilance of trying to hold on to my place, of sensing the invisible boundaries being drawn around me, drained me of my vitality. I stopped pursuing my hobbies with the same vigor. My garden, once a riot of color and life, became less tended, the weeds slowly encroaching. My book club, which had once been a source of lively debate and intellectual stimulation, became just another obligation I attended out of habit. The joy, the spark that had defined my younger years, dimmed, replaced by a quiet resignation. And then there was trust. The betrayal wasn't overt, it was insidious, a slow drip of small slights that accumulated into a flood of disbelief. I had trusted my family, my daughter, my son-in-law to see me, to honor my place, to remember my contributions. I had assumed that love and shared history would be enough. But as I watched them gravitate towards Eleanor, towards the new, shiny version of family she presented, my trust eroded. I began to question everything. Was I truly so easily forgotten? Was my contribution so negligible? Did they ever truly see me, even before? The foundation of my relationships, once solid, began to crack, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable. The silence had not only taken parts of me, it had also taken my faith in the very people I cherished. And that, more than anything, was the most profound and devastating cost. The turning point wasn't a sudden explosion, but a quiet, almost imperceptible shift, like a tectonic plate grinding beneath the earth. It wasn't born of anger, not exactly. It was a cold, clear realization that the silence, which had once been a shield to protect my aching heart, had become a weapon wielded against me. It had allowed them to erase me, to rewrite my history, to make me a phantom in my own home. And I, Celeste, the woman who had always faced challenges head-on, knew deep in my bones that I could no longer stand by. It began with the will, Robert's will. After his passing, his lawyer had handled everything, and I had simply signed the necessary papers, trusting that everything was in order. But one sleepless night, the memory of that Christmas dinner, the stolen seat, the re-narrated stories, and the insidious candle gnawed at me. I retrieved the worn legal folder from the back of my desk drawer. My eyes scanned the familiar clauses, detailing inheritances, charitable donations, and then a small, almost innocuous section about the house. It stated that upon my passing, the house would be left to Clara, with a provision for Eleanor to reside there for a period of time should she choose. It was standard, logical even, given Eleanor's presence in Robert's final years, but the phrasing, so formal and detached, struck me differently now. It wasn't my house in the will's cold language, but the house, Robert's house. And while it was always intended for Clara, the subtle implication was that my 50 years of making it a home, of nurturing life within its walls, were secondary. It was a subtle, legalistic erasure, echoing the emotional ones I had endured. I didn't storm, I didn't rage. Instead, a peculiar calm settled over me. I remembered Robert's words, spoken years ago, during a particularly frustrating legal dispute with a neighbor. Sometimes, Celeste, the quietest moves are the most effective. Like a chess game, you don't declare checkmate until all the pieces are perfectly aligned. That night, I opened an old leather-bound journal, one I hadn't touched in years. Its pages were filled with my neat handwriting, documenting recipes, garden notes, and snippets of our family's history. The real history, as I remembered it. I began to write again, not about my current pain, but about the past. I wrote about Robert's first reaction to this house, his joy at finding the perfect spot by the lake. I wrote about the specific shade of blue we chose for the kitchen, the one Eleanor had painted over. I wrote about the time our eldest grandchild, Thomas, learned to ride his bike in the driveway with Robert cheering him on. I wrote about my mother's favorite rose bush, which I had carefully transplanted from her old garden, and which Eleanor had recently replaced with a sterile, modern shrub. I wasn't writing for an audience. I was writing for myself, a silent act of defiance, a reclaiming of my own narrative. Each word felt like a tiny stone placed back into a wall that had been crumbling. Then came the second catalyst, a faded photograph. I was rummaging through an old hat box in the attic, searching for a forgotten scarf, when I found it. A small black and white photo tucked away at the bottom. It was of Robert and me, taken on our honeymoon. We were standing by a waterfall, young, radiant, our arms around each other, his head tilted towards mine, a look of pure adoration in his eyes. It was a moment of unadulterated happiness, a memory that Eleanor could never touch, could never reshape. Holding that photograph, a profound realization washed over me. They could take my seat, they could retell my stories, they could even rearrange my home, but they could never take my memories. Not truly. And perhaps I didn't need to shout to make them see. I just needed to make them feel. Feel the absence of something they hadn't realized was there. Feel the subtle shift in the ground beneath their feet without ever knowing who had moved it. The silence, which had been a burden, began to transform. It became a crucible, forging a new kind of resolve within me. I started observing, truly observing my family. I listened to their conversations, noting their casual assumptions, their unconscious dismissals. I watched Eleanor, her confident stride, her easy laughter, her subtle manipulations. I began to see the cracks in their carefully constructed facade, the vulnerabilities they didn't even know they possessed. The turning was complete when I walked into the kitchen one afternoon and saw Eleanor pouring tea into my grandmother's teacups, the ones I had inherited and cherished, treating them as if they were everyday crockery. A flicker of something cold and sharp ignited within me. It wasn't vengeance in the dramatic sense. It was a quiet, surgical precision. I would not scream. I would not destroy. I would simply rearrange the map so quietly, so subtly, that by the time they noticed, their footing would already be gone. The silence had become my greatest weapon. The revenge, when it finally arrived, was not loud. It wasn't a shattering of glass or a shouted accusation. It was surgical, quiet, and unfolded over weeks, each move as deliberate as the stitching on a treasured quilt. It began with the candle, that innocent, accusatory beeswax cylinder with Eleanor Finch's initials. I didn't light it immediately. Instead, I moved it from the mantelpiece to my study, placing it on my desk next to my old leather-bound journal. It became a focal point, a silent promise. My first act wasn't even visible to them. It was a meticulous review of Robert's financial records, something I'd always trusted his lawyer with. I'd never been one for numbers, but now, armed with a quiet resolve and a magnifying glass, I pored over ledgers, bank statements, and investment portfolios. Robert had always been a meticulous man, and his records were a testament to his foresight. Tucked away in an old dust-covered box, I found a series of share certificates for a small local textile company, shares he had acquired decades ago, long before Eleanor, long before even Clara was born. They were for a substantial number of shares, but the company had never really taken off, existing quietly in the background of a diversified portfolio. What struck me was a tiny detail, a note in Robert's own hand specifying that these particular shares were to be held in trust for Celeste to ensure her lifelong comfort. It was a private agreement, not legally binding, but a profound testament to his enduring care for me. Eleanor, I knew, had no idea about this particular investment. It was too small to warrant immediate attention in the grand scheme of his estate, and he had simply never mentioned it to her. The company, it turned out, was now undergoing a quiet resurgence, its value slowly, steadily climbing. My next move was subtle. I reached out to a distant cousin, a quiet, unassuming man named Peter, who had a knack for navigating financial intricacies. We hadn't spoken in years, but he had always been fond of Robert and me. I explained vaguely that I was looking to reorganize some old family holdings. Peter, ever discreet, asked no probing questions. Over the course of a month, through a series of carefully timed transactions, I had him sell off those specific textile shares, slowly in small batches, ensuring no sudden market fluctuations or red flags were raised. The funds, a not inconsiderable sum, were then quietly transferred into a new separate account, solely in my name, an account that no one in the family knew existed. It was not taking anything from them, not directly. It was simply reclaiming what had always been implicitly mine, a silent withdrawal from a shared future they thought they controlled. Then came the second layer of the act, targeting Eleanor's comfortable reign over the house. She had, in her efficient way, taken over the management of the property, from coordinating repairs to overseeing the gardener. She often spoke of her vision for the lake house, subtly dismissing my own years of nurturing it. I had learned, through casual conversations with the gardener, that Eleanor had plans to remove the old, gnarled wisteria vine that draped across the back porch. A vine Robert had planted for me on our first anniversary. It was an old, sprawling thing, a bit messy, but its blooms filled the air with a sweet scent every spring, a scent that still brought tears to my eyes. Eleanor considered it too wild and planned to replace it with something more modern. I didn't confront her. Instead, I waited until she and Clara were away for a weekend. Then I called our longtime gardener, a kind man named Miguel who had known me for decades. I told him I wanted to prune the wisteria, a very specific kind of pruning, one that would rejuvenate it, not destroy it. I showed him old photographs of how the wisteria had looked in its prime, lush and vibrant. And then, as we walked the garden, I subtly pointed out a number of small, almost invisible saplings of invasive species that Eleanor had unknowingly planted around the wisteria. "Miguel," I said, my voice soft, "these little ones, they're very aggressive. They'll choke out the wisteria if we don't catch them early. We must be very thorough in their removal." Miguel, dedicated to the health of the plants, nodded gravely. He didn't know that the invasive species were rare, delicate saplings Eleanor had painstakingly acquired to create her modern garden vision. He simply followed my instructions, clearing the ground with efficient precision. The wisteria remained, untouched in its core. But Eleanor's future plans for that part of the garden, her subtle assertion of ownership, were quietly, permanently thwarted. The final, most poignant act involved the candle itself. On the anniversary of Robert's death, a day when the family always gathered for a quiet remembrance, Eleanor had planned a small, tasteful ceremony by the lake. She had selected a new, ornate candle for the occasion, one she had purchased herself to be lit in Robert's honor. As dusk settled and the family gathered, Eleanor began her eulogy, her voice gentle, yet undeniably taking center stage. Just as she reached for her candle, I, with an almost imperceptible movement, reached for the old beeswax candle on the mantelpiece, the one with RM plus EF etched on its side. In the soft twilight, the initials were almost invisible. With a steady hand, I lit it. The flame flickered to life, small but resolute. No one noticed the initials. No one saw the faint carving. They saw only a woman, a grieving widow, lighting a candle in memory of her late husband. But I knew. And Eleanor, as her eyes briefly flickered to the familiar wax, registered a flicker of confusion, a tiny moment of disorientation. The candle she had chosen remained unlit, the air filled with the scent of old beeswax, mingling with the lake air. It was not a grand gesture. It was a reclaiming of a small personal history, a whisper of a forgotten name, brought back into the light of my memory, right there, in the quiet heart of my home. The ground beneath them had begun to shift. The balance had shifted. It wasn't a seismic event. No one screamed, no one pointed. It was more like the slow, steady settling of foundations after a tremor, where everything looks the same on the surface, but the underlying structure has subtly realigned. After the quiet remembrance of Robert's passing, where the old beeswax candle flickered defiantly, a new atmosphere permeated the house. Eleanor, typically so buoyant and in control, seemed off. It wasn't overt. She still moved with her usual grace, still smiled her practiced smile. But I caught her more than once, glancing at the mantelpiece, her gaze lingering on the spot where the etched candle had stood, then flitting to the unlit, ornate one she had chosen. A flicker of something unreadable, confusion, disquiet, would cross her features before she smoothed it away. She never mentioned it, never asked why that candle, not hers, had been lit. And in her silence, I felt a quiet victory. The financial reorganization with Peter continued, unseen by the rest of the family. The new account, brimming with the quiet gains from the textile shares, was my secret garden, a tangible manifestation of my reclaimed autonomy. It wasn't about wealth. It was about the security of knowing I had a choice, a path that was entirely my own, independent of the careful provisions Robert had made that were now so easily overseen by others. I began to indulge in small, private pleasures, a new set of paints, of a quality I hadn't allowed myself in years, a weekend trip to a coastal town I'd always wanted to visit, just me, alone with my thoughts and the sound of the waves. These weren't acts of defiance. They were acts of self-reclamation. Clara, busy as ever, seemed less inclined to rely on Eleanor for every detail of family life. Perhaps it was the subtle absence of Eleanor's modern garden vision around the wisteria, which now, thanks to Miguel's careful work, was thriving with renewed vigor. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. I noticed Clara coming to me more often with questions about Robert, little things she'd forgotten or wanted to confirm. "Mother, do you remember what Dad always said about the trick to making his famous chili?" Or, "Grandma, where did Dad hide the spare keys to the old boathouse?" These were questions Eleanor couldn't answer, questions that quietly, unequivocally established my irreplaceable connection to Robert's past, to the real, lived history of our family. The grandchildren, too, seemed to gravitate back, not in a dramatic rush, but slowly, drawn by the quiet presence I now radiated. I started baking again, not just the obligatory holiday treats, but my old, cherished recipes. The smell of cinnamon and warm apples filled the kitchen, a scent that had always been synonymous with my presence in this house. They would wander in, drawn by the aroma, and sit on the worn kitchen stools, watching me, sometimes asking questions. I would tell them stories, not of grand adventures, but of everyday life, of family quirks and childhood mishaps, stories that Eleanor could never recount because she simply hadn't been there. They listened, captivated, absorbing the rich tapestry of a past that was uniquely mine to share. No one screamed, no one pointed fingers. The changes were too subtle, too deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. Arthur still held court, but his narratives about Robert felt less authoritative. Eleanor still occupied my old seat at the head of the table, but the power emanating from it felt diminished. It was as if the invisible threads of control, which had been slowly tightening around me, had been quietly snipped. They didn't know how or when or by whom. They simply felt the subtle, unsettling shift in the ground beneath their feet. I didn't need to say a word. The silence, which had once suffocated me, had become my ally. It had allowed me to observe, to plan, to execute, and finally, to witness the quiet unraveling of their comfortable assumptions. I had rewritten the ending they thought they'd authored, not with a flourish of defiance, but with the quiet, persistent truth of my own existence. The lake house, once a testament to my fading presence, felt like home again, and I, Celeste, was finally truly released.